There we go. All right, well, hello and welcome everyone. Last time we left off talking about the crisis of confidence and the and kind of the economic shortfalls of the 1970s and how that led to a general cultural malaise. Um, we didn't have enough time to go further, so we ended up talking a little bit about how like Star Wars is reflective of its particular time. By the way, that kind of uh, literary or critical review is called new historicism. It's a pretty popular technique in terms of literary analysis, but it really does make you reinterpret a lot of popular media. Um, it's a bit difficult to see in the present since you don't really know what life is like. You don't know everything that's going on. You're just part of it. But that's one of the powers of history, is that we can look back with greater hindsight and see these things. So um, you know, try applying that to old movies that you like that are more than 15 years old, that then you can actually kind of see the cultural zeitgeist that goes into these things. um Makes you reinterpret a lot. um but we don't we have a lot to get through in terms of today's lecture, so um let's just jump right into it. uh there we go. So the um that culture of malaise and disillusionment um wasn't the sole thing. There was still a great deal of hope, especially being put into what's called the Equal Rights Amendment. This amendment is, as you can see here, this is literally just the entire amendment. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Um, Newer versions of this now say gender rather than sex. Um, but this is the 1970s, and trans liberation is still very much not a big part of the movement. Anyways, um the people are making noises. Um but this actually had a long time coming. It developed over time. Um you might recall from earlier in this class, there was the first wave of feminism that resulted in the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, and made sure that no state could bar people from voting on account of sex. Um, the um, this was followed by this was most prominently pushed by a group called the National Women's Party. It was a single issue third party, um, and organized by a great deal of prominent suffragettes of the first wave. And they actually proposed this initial amendment in 1921. So this thing's been going through Congress for a century now. Um, and they would submit it to Congress every single year. It wouldn't go anywhere, would get killed in committee. Um, and so it took another wave of feminism to really start pushing this, and that's with the second wave. The second wave is typically dated to the release of Betty Friedan's book, The Second Sex, which is actually based on Simone de Beauvoir's The Feminine Mystique. But it discussed how patriarchal power um, uh, mul- uh, created spheres of influences, and there was the domestic sphere where women were relegated, and the public sphere, which was the man's job. um Friedan is not well regarded anymore because of her anti uh gay rhetoric, but um in the early 60s to early 70s, she was kind of the figurehead of the movement. Um, that same year, in 1963, Congress passed the Equal Pay Act, which technically made it illegal to pay somebody different on account of sex. The problem is it was basically unenforceable. Um, there's still quite a gender pay gap even today. Um, and so trying to deal with all this, that old equal rights amendment that was proposed back in 1921 kept on coming up over and over again, and then became kind of the the thing that people wanted to get this going. And so that led to the creation of the National Organization for Women, or just NOW. Um, as in, now is the time to pass the ARA. Um, this now formed in 1966, and the ERA didn't get into Congress, didn't get into a vote until 1970 in Congress, which it was vetoed. But in 1972, it was actually passed, meaning that it went through Congress in both houses, and once it's passed, it's out for ratification. Now, there's multiple ways of ratifying an amendment, but they've always been ratified by states ratifying it. Basically, state legislatures vote to ratify it, and it takes um, well, at this point, it took 35 states to ratify it. Um, and in the amendment, there was a ratification period of 7 years, meaning that it had to be ratified before 1979. The problem was a um there we've talked a little bit about this kind of like cultural malaise and all that kind of stuff, and we'll see in a couple of slides that this resulted in kind of a turn to the right, as the U.S. steadily pivoted rightward in terms of politics, and no one exemplified this more than a lady named Phyllis Schlafly. I can never say her name right. Phyllis Schlafly, um, who created a campaign called Stop ERA. Um, she said that this would debase traditional family values, and send their children out to war, their daughters out to war, because um, mind you, this was passed in 1972. The draft was still in effect in 1972. Well, it wasn't actually being used, but it was still on the books. It wouldn't be off the books until 1973. Um, the Even though the Army had already changed to an all volunteer force in 1971, but that's neither here nor there. The uh, the argument was that drafting women was abhorrent, but this is kind of at the crux of the argument for the ERA, is that um, you know yeah, if you want equal rights, you have to have you have to equally pay for it as well. Um, so gender discrimination in terms of the draft would no longer be constitutional. Um, and interestingly enough, Phyllis Schlafly's entire argument doesn't really matter anymore, because the Supreme Court actually ruled a few years ago that it is illegal it is unconstitutional to discriminate by gender in terms of the draft. So we now have a female draft if we ever use it. Um, the this But that was quite a powerful argument in the 1970s, especially after all of the Vietnam War, and that nobody wanted to send their daughters to the Vietnam War, let alone their sons. Um, so the so Schlafly really managed to stamp down the ERA to the point that in 1978 there was a big um, push to extend the ratification period because there were only 4 states left to ratify this thing. Um, Although there have been some states that have ratified it recently. For instance, I think it was Virginia that just ratified it a couple of years ago. But since it is past the ratification period, didn't actually get ratified. But with those recent states that have ratified it, we have actually gone past the 35 state requirement. But that's only recently, and the problem is the ratification period was going to end in 1979. So in 1978, there was a big Congress organized, actually funded by the federal government to kind of bring together this large second wave feminism movement, primarily organized by NOW, but plenty of other groups. For instance, the most popular person there was oh man, I'm forgetting her name. Really famous for wearing her glasses weird. But either way, they have this big Congress. People like Betty Friedan finally kind of relinquish on the lesbian question and start actually saying that, like, yeah, lesbians should have equal rights too, and stuff like that. But at the same time, Schlafly organizes what she called the Eagle Forum, which was basically a anti-ERA rally. So Congress did pass an extension that technically was to extend the ratification period all the way into 1982, but no new states would ratify it. Also, there's technically you can't extend a ratification period. It's in the original amendment. You can't amend an amendment before it is amending the actual Constitution. That's unconstitutional. But Congress did it anyways, but it went nowhere. So this kind of like hope for new rights and greater equality that the New Left had been pushing for since the 60s was dashed upon the rocks of Stop ERA. And this kind of like forlorn hope really defined, the Carter administration. There we go. So Carter was elected in 76. It was actually the last election that a Democrat would take most of the South, because Carter himself was a peanut farmer from Georgia. Well, his attempt at re-election, the only southern state that sent him electors was his own home state. So the Democrats had thoroughly lost the South by this point. And Carter was seen as kind of a conservative in the Democratic Party. When during the primaries, he had gone up against California's governor, Jerry Brown, or for those who might actually remember Jerry Brown, euphemistically named Emperor Moonbeam, because he was quite the hippie and he actually had some wacky ideas with the moon. But he wanted to have wireless phone service beamed down to Earth from the moon. So and hence Emperor Moonbeam. Um, he was actually recently California's governor again, so that's quite weird. Um, so with this kind of like turn towards conservatism in the Democratic Party, Republicans had already been turning rightward for quite a while, but the Democrats were kind of seen as coming back to conservatism um, after 40 years of the New Deal. Um, turns out he actually had quite a few progressive things. Um, for instance, he wanted to create a basically a um, a what we have right currently in terms of an individual mandate for healthcare, for health insurance. That was Carter's idea, and this was kind of going against Ted Kennedy. You might remember we talked about Chappaquiddick and that. Ted Kennedy's signature bill was that he wanted to create a national healthcare system, kind of like what is in Britain today. Um, but this was kind of a compromise between the two in the hopes that it would be the first step towards an NHS. But it didn't go anywhere, and while Carter was definitely a social progressive, he was a fiscal conservative, um, or what we will talk about in just a second, a neoliberal. Um, this resulted in him fervently deregulating a number of industries, including the airline industry, um, the railroad industry, which had been under a federal basically a federal monopoly called Amtrak for a while, and now other people could compete again. And he also deregulated like the busing industry, and um, he also deregulated the brewing industry, allowing for home brew and microbrews. So all these nice breweries we have around are thanks to Carter's deregulation. Because up until this point, it since the end of Prohibition, the beer industry had been ruled by the big Rocky Mountain goat piss kind of beer, like Budweiser and that. And there was no ability to enter the industry without buying up a brewery that had somehow managed to make it all the way through Prohibition. So there was some competition, but that's the only way you could enter the market. So this deregulation allowed for that. So deregulation was under Carter was quite a different beast than we'll see later on in class. The Now we talked about the energy crisis under Nixon, but there was another energy crisis during his time. Mostly because of not our foreign policy, but because of foreign events, the Iranian Revolution, which we'll get to in the next slide. He also kept on trying to cut welfare programs that were left over from the Johnson administration. For instance, he wanted to cut welfare and that didn't really go anywhere. But he also wanted to he actually wanted to cut welfare and replace it with what was then called a negative income tax. Basically, how we have a graduated income tax where a certain where if your first $50,000 that you make is taxed one way, then the next 50 is taxed another on up until you get to the marginal tax rate at the top, which is I think anything above 400,000 now. So once you hit 400,000, you get the marginal tax rate. Otherwise, it gets cut lower and lower, like that. But the idea would be to shift that entire thing so that people who made below a certain amount would get a negative income tax, as in, the state would pay them for having not made enough money. Um, this idea was basically to guarantee a minimum income for all Americans. Um, he also wanted to have a program that was that guaranteed federal jobs to the unemployed, so that we could have a maximum a full employment like we had since after World War II. In that, remember that unemployment was skyrocketing at this point. Um, but Congress simply would not work with him. One of the few things that he managed to get through was a bill to give back the Panama Canal to Panama in the year 1999. Mind you, this is 1977 that this is all being argued. So, it's long off in the future, and that's one of the few things he's able to get through. And Carter finally gets fed up, gets on and got on television to complain about this in what's called the Malaise speech, where he said, "It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America." Um, so when you have a president talking like that, um, complaining that he can't get any bills through and that, you could see this kind of cultural malaise that ruled the 1970s. And then there was what was sometimes called Billygate. This is actually the first time that the Gate moniker was added to something. And Billygate was that it was his that Billy Carter, Jimmy Carter's brother, was, first of all, he was a weirdo. He had like a beer company that um he would like go to Congress and try to sell um off the back of his brother's administration. um, he was famous for before getting on planes or getting off of planes, he'd piss on the tarmac. This was back when you would typically have to walk across the tarmac and get on on the steps up to a plane. Though perhaps certain presidents should be taking a different route nowadays rather than falling down them. The the But what was particularly galling is that it found out that he had been taking as many as $200,000 from Libyan diplomats, and for basically unknown reasons. This investigation ended up really embroiling the Carter administration as a whole because, of the president's relationship to his brother. So in general, the Carter administration is seen as quite a failure because of all this. Just could not deal with the crisis of confidence and instead just complained about it to the entire country. But in foreign affairs, it's more of a mixed bag. The You guys might recall that in 1975, the North Vietnamese, that should say South Vietnam, not North Vietnam. uh, the the South Vietnamese were invaded by North Vietnam during what's called the Ho Chi Minh Campaign, and they conquered South Vietnam, ending the Vietnam War, and the U.S. refused to intervene in this next round of the Vietnam War. Um, while the Reagan administration, not the Reagan, the Nixon administration had managed to quiet down Cold War tensions and bring about what's called detente. Um, for things with the in 1969 there was the strategic arms limitation talks, which led to the 75 Helsinki Accords, which solidified non-aggression. And that same year, the space race was kind of ended by by an Apollo capsule and a Soyuz capsule rendezvousing in space. And these but these strategic arms limitation talks were to, like, limit the amount of nuclear weapons in that, and another round of those came during the Carter administration. But the detente was quick to end, in that, and SALT II, as it's called, would not be ratified because of what would be happening in the Middle East. Well, not the Middle East, but in Central Asia. But as I already talked about, Carter did manage to get that Panamanian treaty ratified. So that's a big win for his administration. But even bigger was, after all of those tensions with OPEC and all that kind of stuff, and U.S. support of Israel, Carter managed to bring both Egypt and Israel to talk at Camp David, a retreat for the president in Pennsylvania. And they sat there for a couple of weeks. The prime minister of both Egypt and Israel, to hash over peace, because Israel was currently occupying the Sinai Peninsula. It's still they still occupy the Golan Heights. The question of how to deal with the West Bank and the Gaza Strip were still up in the air, and basically, they came to an accord saying that Israel would remove themselves from the Sinai Peninsula, and Egypt would recognize Israel, kind of ending this long series of wars between the Arab League and Israel. Egypt was kind of the most powerful part of the Arab League, and so this kind of ended their ongoing tensions. But we'll also see that there are some unintentional effects that kind of lead to the war on terror in the last lecture of this class. Carter also normalized relations with China, saying that he would recognize China and not Taiwan, because up until 1979, the U.S. had recognized Taiwan as the Republic of China, and refused to recognize the People's Republic of China, or PRC, mainland China. And as part of this One China policy, as it's called, where the U.S. does not recognize Taiwan as an independent country, and it's you have to pick and choose which government you're going to recognize as China, and so that meant the PRC is that. Um, in in the UN, um, Taiwan was replaced with the PRC, and that includes on the uh, the Security Council, which can basically any member of the Executive Security Council can veto um, any violent action um, with just one vote. So it's quite a position of power in the UN. Um, and the ROC had to give it up to the PRC. Um, so these were all kind of seen as Carter's like greatest achievements as president, but right at the tail end of his administration, um, two looming crises came about. The first being the Iranian hostage crisis. Iran had a coup in 1978. Um, well, not a coup. Had a big arson attack at a movie theater, which killed 420 people there, which set off a bunch of protests. This was originally a bunch of leftist protests, but in 1979, um, the uh, the Shah was overthrown by these folks, and they brought in um, a dissident leader who had been hiding out in France for a while, but with the um, with the overthrow of the Shah, they could bring in this guy known as the Ayatollah Khomeini, and the Ayatollah um, was an Islamic fundamentalist. This was kind of the first fundamentalist Islamic fundamentalist state in the Middle East. Um, you could argue um, that Indonesia was that beforehand, but that gets kind of weird. Um, but with this, because the U.S. had supported the Shah and even helped him regain control of his country in 1954, um, there was a great deal of animosity to Americans, and so this picture right here is actually from the revolution of them burning an American flag. Um, but that American flag, you might notice, has these little tassels on it. So those tassels actually have a political purpose because that was the flag that was at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. And so protesters overwhelmed the Marines at the U.S. Embassy there and took everyone hostage. Um, this this resulted in quite a crisis, right? You've got um, a bunch of Americans being held hostage by Islamic radicals, um, and a few managed to escape, but then the Carter administration tried to send in special forces, specifically a new branch of the special forces called Delta Force, um, that was supposed to deal with counterinsurgency and terrorism and that. Um, but this was kind of the first outing of the Delta Force, and what happened is that they were landing on a rally point in the middle of the desert, and the wind pushed one helicopter into another. Um, so that didn't go too well. And Carter basically couldn't do anything. Um, and we'll see with the Reagan administration afterwards that Reagan used Carter's weakness on this. But to make matters worse, Afghanistan was having its own problems. In 1978, they had a coup in which a batch of communists overthrew the uh, the uh, um, the nationalist government. Um, and then on top of that, um, they started degenerating into their own fighting, where these communists would end up killing each other. And so, um, in the midst of all this, a U.S. ambassador was killed in Afghanistan in February of 1979. Um, and by the end of that year, the USSR decided to intervene. Um, and so they invaded Afghanistan. Um, and this was kind of, um, worrisome, because this seemed like the Soviets were not just trying to stop the infighting there between the communists. Because, for instance, one of their first major operations was to corner the then current president of Afghanistan and kill him in the presidential palace. So and so that they could install their own um, leadership in the Communist Party of Afghanistan. So you could see uh, this was worrisome. This wasn't just like Vietnam, where the U.S. was certainly engaging in some of that kind of stuff, but mostly trying to do so covertly. So when we uh, sponsored the assassination of a Vietnamese president, we did so covertly. This was the Soviet military doing this. And so um, this appeared that like they were going to continue expansion, possibly into Pakistan and India, or more worrisome. Remember, the Iranian Revolution came about with that is a loud truck. Came about with a bunch of leftist influence until the Ayatollah came in. So the worry was that they would expand to Iran as well, and then possibly further to like their allies in Syria and um, and their former allies of Egypt. So there's a lot of worry there, and so Carter creates what he called what is often called the Carter Doctrine, which basically said that the U.S. will protect any assets in the Persian Gulf against Soviet incursion. So this kind of put the U.S. On a war path with the Soviet Union after having basically a decade of detente. This ended detente, um, and on as a protest of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. pulled out of the Olympics in 1980, which were going to happen in Moscow. So we boycotted them, and in return, the Soviets, actually the entire Warsaw Pact, um, boycotted the Olympics that were going to happen in 1984, which were in Los Angeles. Um, so Carter is pretty much disgraced by Afghanistan and Iran. Um, and while he was conservative, um, a new form of politics really came to arise because of all of this stuff happening, because of deindustrialization, because of stagflation, because of cultural malaise, because of um, foreign policy failures, because of domestic policy failures, and the end of the ERA and that. And this new form of politics is called neoliberalism. Um, this this neoliberalism is basically the status quo we live in today. Um, it is sometimes described as the consumption of public goods by the private. Um, it emphasizes privatization, deregulation, globalization, free trade, austerity, and the reduction of government spending. Um, so um, this this kind of fiscal conservatism or market liberalism, um, interestingly enough, market liberalism um, is fiscal conservatism, whereas market conservatism is fiscal liberalism, just to make things confusing. But when you say the word liberal, it doesn't necessarily mean the more progressives or anything along those lines. What liberalism ultimately refers to is liberation. That's why it's liberal. Um, to liberate, and here they're talking about liberating the economy, and specifically from liberating the economy from government control. The idea is basically that as the Chicago School really pushed um, the throughout the 1960s, was this idea that the market can handle itself better than government regulation. Um, and you might recall that we've already talked about the downfall of Keynesian economics upon because of stagflation and that. Um, and so even before the Chicago school started pushing fiscal conservatism, um, there was this guy named Friedrich Hayek who wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom that supposed that things like the New Deal resulted in a centrally planned economy that was essentially a form of totalitarianism. This is going back to that old idea that like the New Deal was socialism um, rather than reform capitalism. And so the move to neoliberalism was to get rid of those reforms. Um, and so the ultimate idea of this is to kind of, instead of treating people like groups, even though that's not actually what reform capitalism does, but um, the idea is to treat people like groups, that people are treated like groups and therefore are not treated like individuals. And so this idea is to atomize individuality, to treat everyone as an individual rather than an economic group. Now, you can see that this is a lot of hand waving away a lot of the problems that come along with laissez-faire capitalism, as we saw way early in this class. But this is what all this malaise throughout the 1970s was allowing to come to fruition, was this turn to the right. And so instead of welfare and that kind of stuff and helping people advance in society from the bottom up, it now focused on the top down, often called trickle down economics. And there's a number of reasons why neoliberalism came to be. It's actually a huge argument in the history profession as to when neoliberalism starts. Like, some people would take great umbrage with me calling Carter a neoliberal, but they're wrong. and the there's a lot of argument over like the actual definition in that. I'm giving you guys a very broad coverage of something that historians dedicate their entire careers to arguing about. So the one of the ideas in terms of its origin was this idea of getting tough on crime. There was a lot of urban blight, as in cities that were becoming visibly impoverished. If you saw New York City in 1975, you would think it was a war zone. buildings crumbling, trash everywhere, shootings happening all the time, um, violence peaking to the point that murder rates were the worst in the U.S. in 1981 and 1980 and 91. Um, so rapidly increasing crime in that. Um, and so people started saying that they needed to get tough on crime. This, um, rather than fixing the problem with this like urban blight and that. So during the Nixon administration, instead of dealing with the unemployment, rapidly rising unemployment and that, and stagnating economy, uh, he started saying that it was all the drugs and that, and so he reformed the way that the U.S. had been dealing with drug regulation up until 1969, and he started what's called the War on Drugs. Um, and this was basically to demonize hippies who were, drug users. Um, but the this becomes even worse when the economy gets worse throughout the 1970s. For instance, New York City hit a fiscal crisis in 1975 where they looked like they were about to do to go bankrupt. The biggest city in the country was about to go bankrupt, um, and this uh, resulted in calls for a federal bailout in that. Um, and then President Ford, um, and this is an actual headline. It says Ford to city drop dead. Um, vows he vowed that he would veto any bailout of the New York City fiscal crisis. It did abate, but they came real close to bankruptcy. Um, and so you could see there is this steady change towards neoliberalism, and how um, people would get tough was that they would they would implement what's called austerity measures, and austerity measures are basically cutting government programs to cut government spending in that, and saying that people don't need it, they need to live more austere lives. So going after welfare in that is part of neoliberalism. But this is also part of a cultural change. You might remember we are talking about like atomizing individuality in that, and this results in what's called the cultural turn throughout the late 60s and to mid 1980s. Um, the cultural turn has this huge effect on um, the liberal arts even today. Um, but probably most importantly was this rise of what's called postmodernism. Um, and the idea of postmodernism is that it's really founded on like individual perception. So this, you can see how neoliberalism results in postmodernism. Um, and so postmodernism has an emphasis on pluralism, criticism of social structures, um, and most importantly, skepticism of grand narratives, as in, um, these kinds of stories where America is a shining city on a hill, and that, which you know, postmodernism, and we've talked about the New Left before, and that result in another political group called neoconservatives, and neoconservatives are born from the backlash to like the counterculture, the New Left, and postmodernism. Um, but it too has a cultural emphasis. Um, as Reagan would define it, is peace through strength. Um, that it's this kind of hawkish um, nationalism, this reassertion of nationalism through setting the U.S. on a warlike um, stance. So you have the rise of, um, because of neoliberalism, you have the rise of postmodernism and neoconservatism, um, and basically every president since Carter has been a neoliberal. They have all sought to cut government spending in one way or another and have all failed miserably at that. Besides cutting government funding to social programs, they always seem to increase it to things like military spending or police spending. And that has not really changed. So some people define neoliberalism as the reassertion of class power, as in elitism. That the government shouldn't be helping people from the bottom up. That should be what companies do by creating jobs and all that kind of stuff. And so all of this is in flux during Carter's administration, but really comes to the fore during the 1980 election, with a new Republican president who would basically set the standard for how we do politics to the present, and that man was Ronald Reagan. So Reagan was a Hollywood actor prior to entering politics. He had actually been the president of the Screen Actors Guild from 1947 to 52, and from 1959 to 60. He did a bunch of movies at first, and then moved on to television. But you could already see his conservative leanings by the 50s, when he testified, when he basically tattled on other actors for being communists. And this did not exactly bode well for how he would act. He switched to being a Republican right around the 64 election. You might recall that that's when Barry Goldwater went, and Barry Goldwater started that whole Southern strategy thing, and that we talked about with the party switch stuff. So Reagan was very much part of this switch, and so he finally decided to enter politics in 1966 and was elected governor of California. So throughout the 60s, you might recall how the Berkeley free speech movement was kind of the impetus that started the New Left in that. But for instance, during a protest in a park in what is it called? It's just south of Berkeley, and I can't remember it. Whatever. They took over a park for a week, and it was called the People's Park protest. And he called out the National Guard for it. It was a completely peaceful protest. And it was just part of that summer of love back in 66 and 67. He also became quite fearful of the Black Panthers, which came to power, not to power, but was part of the Black Power movement, and willfully open carried and that kind of stuff, leading to California to ban open carry weapons. They actually tried they didn't try. They invaded the California Capitol fully armed and everything to protest the passage of the Mulford Act. And instead of that being an effective protest measure, it actually got it passed literally that same day. Don't go trying to scare legislators with guns. It will backfire. But Reagan was clearly a force of conservatism, though I should point out he actually signed the first pro-abortion bill in the country during his tenure in as governor of California, and he also created a no-fault divorce bill. So, like, despite despite a lot of modern day perceptions of the man, he was actually a little bit more moderate than he would become. But in 1976, he tried to primary Gerald Ford, failed at that, basically because he tried to act more conservative than Ford, basically calling Ford too much of a liberal, and that didn't go too well. But it worked in the following primary, which he gained the Republican nomination in 1980. Carter, at the same time, you might recall, was being seen as weak in that. And so Ted Kennedy actually tried to primary Carter, which, because of the whole healthcare situation, because he thought that Carter was being too conservative about healthcare. And his concession speech, Ted Kennedy's concession speech during that primary, was that famous "The dream shall never die," referring to healthcare in that. But it kind of hasn't it? And so you could see a split in the Democratic Party, just as Reagan is using Carter's weakness against him. And then, so with all of this cultural malaise and that we've been talking about this entire time, this crisis of confidence, Reagan's campaign slogan was, "Let's make America great again." Yes, MAGA was invented by Reagan, but it had a completely different meaning than it does today. His "Let's make America great again" was talking about trying to get past this crisis of confidence, to bring back those cultural values, those traditional cultural values. He had turned further and further to the right throughout the 1970s, as a lot of people did, and became a neoliberal, a staunch neoliberal. So he wanted to decrease taxes. He was like openly hawkish and anti-communist. He used a bunch of dog whistles about states' rights and forced busing and that kind of thing. He courted evangelical Christians when talking about how abortion shouldn't be legal, and that, even though he had literally passed the first abortion bill. He embodied that 1970s rightward drift. And so this idea of hawkishness, nationalism, courting evangelicals and that kind of stuff, won him the election. Got him only 50.7% of the vote, though. So it's not like it was a landslide or anything. But it was an electoral landslide. But he was also the then oldest president to ever be elected. He was 69 years old. Nice. And the time from 1981 to 1992 is known as the Reagan era because his vice president would become president after him. And this built upon the political influence of the crisis of confidence in that, but went in a completely rightward direction, which is what we will talk about next week. So, glad we managed to get through that in time. Have some time for discussion. Hold on a second. All right. So, with that neoliberalism, especially with the rise of neoliberalism during the Carter administration, and this rightward shift in that, I kind of motion to the fact that it's heavily argued as to what caused it. But what in your minds caused this rightward drift? Say that again.
I think people were mostly getting upset and tired of
You're coming in very muffled. Anybody else want to try to answer that?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so I think that a large part of the reason that we had that shift was because people were getting upset with so much government control in their kind of like everyday lives, going back to the whole idea of like, like liberation from.
So what was that government control?
I don't know. There's a lot of different facets of life in which things like increase in military spending.
And now the wind is taking your voice out.
It's just like an increase in military spending and a lack of resources being allocated to different social issues that might need a little bit more attention. Things like education, poverty.
So, one thing to point out is that after the Vietnam War, there was a big drawdown in the U.S. Army. We went from having about 500,000 people in the U.S. Army to 200,000. Only, that was the authorized amount. It actually ended up being quite a bit more than 200,000. It was 250. But at the height of the Vietnam War, there was nearly 600,000 people in Vietnam, like soldiers in Vietnam. So, huge drawdown. The U.S. Navy decommissioned a number of ships, including the only 2 battleships that were still in the service. They'd actually draw out the battleships again in 1990 in 1991 through 93 because of the Persian Gulf War, and one of the battleships actually still remains in mothball, ready to be pulled out if we ever wanted to use it again. But the point being, they were decommissioned because of that, and so like this ceased big production of new jet technology, new Air Force stuff as well. It's like across the board, there was a significant reduction in military spending. And you can also see that like there was, while there was that Great Society stuff from the 60s, Nixon didn't really bring about any new welfare programs or anything. So there wasn't really any like government control that hadn't already been there for decades. Um, so, um, but that is actually part of the rhetoric, right? That welfare is somehow a social control rather than a social benefit. Um, Now you can see I'm a bit skeptical of it because the fact is that's not what welfare is. Um, but that is how it was portrayed. Reagan would regularly refer to what he called welfare queens, which was actually um, quite openly racist. But the this idea was that um, people who were on welfare would, uh, exploit the system so that they didn't have to work. And you see this kind of rhetoric all the time in politics, even today. But Reagan really kind of like starts that. Um, but yeah, it's a lot more complicated than um, trying to get the government off of people's backs. That's um, like Reagan would actually increase military spending. He was openly hawkish, um, and you know tried to get the U.S. out of Vietnam syndrome. He wouldn't succeed, but um, his vice president, who would become president, would with the Gulf War. Um, but yeah, military spending, like the rhetoric of spending ultimately isn't what neoliberalism is about, right? What it's about is who is being spent on. Is it the elites of society, or is it from the top down or bottom up? Trickle down, bottom up. Um, Reform capitalism is trying to reform the system in a way that benefits the lower classes, and um, laissez-faire capitalism benefits the elites who have the most spending power because they're elites. They have the most money, obviously, means more spending power. That's why a lot of scholars call this a reassertion of um, class power. Um, we'll be talking a lot about this in the second to last lecture about the new millennium and how historians often like to call the era we're in now as the second Gilded Age. We talked a little bit about this when we were talking about the original Gilded Age. And this kind of this immense economic equality. And there's actually a fun Twitter account that it's called like Reagan in graphs, and it shows a bunch of graphs where you can see this clear split forming right in the late 70s and early 80s, and they just drop a little picture of Reagan right where the split happens because it's the Reagan administration. Over and over and over again, you can see this split in terms of um, elites continuing to gain power, whereas and when I say power, I mean money, because money is power. And the lower classes stagnating from there. So while Reagan will be successful in terms of generating a better U.S. economy, that better U.S. economy doesn't really benefit the lower classes. So this, but you can see this isn't just about like getting the government off their back. I mean, after all, they talk openly about getting tough on crime, and toughening up, and on like welfare queens and that kind of thing. And that's kind of the government imposing its will on people, not the other way around, right? So one other thing could be like the cause of neoliberalism. And this is an open question. Don't think that you can answer it wrong. Anybody?
So I was thinking since so many people were returning from war, there was probably a high level of unemployment, which
Mhm.
usually in turn means a high level of poverty. And it seems to be a trend that in the US, when there's higher levels of poverty, the following president is a conservative president, which helps usually with the economy. And so I think that could be like where that shift towards neoliberalism helped like started, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense.
So like stagflation and the energy crises and that, like the actual economic problems of the crisis of confidence. Um, yeah, I mean that's definitely part of it, right? There's you have um, stagflation just completely destroying the Keynesian model of economics, um, and multiple presidents having no idea how to deal with it because the entire New Deal from the 1930s all the way until um, the early 1970s was based on Keynesian economics. This idea um, of spending when the economy is down and kind of hitting the brakes when the economy's up. Well, it depended um, on inflation going down during a bad economy. um, and it did just the opposite. And so the entire Keynesian model fell apart because of stagflation. Um, and neoliberalism stepped in with that whole Chicago school idea that it was that just let the market decide, let the market do things. It can react faster than the government, so why are we letting the government um you know control the economy in any way, deregulate, you know privatize, um and remove welfare programs. Like that's the calling cards. And you can see this is very much about economics, but you can also see, as we talked about, um, cultural effects. For instance, remember that talk that we had yesterday about Star Wars, um, and like the cultural effects of the crisis of confidence um, are fed by these economic things. But like when we talk about politics today, are we really talking about like, you know, well, the inflation rate went up to this point, and then the unemployment rate is here, and blah blah blah. Let's talk about rates and graphs. Or are we talking about like, you know, um, cultural things like whether or not America is great, or which is nationalism, or you know, uh, are we talking about how we treat minorities and that kind of thing? Like that's cultural. So, neoliberalism is ultimately a economic thing, and you're absolutely right that that's one of the main factors. But what kind of cultural input is there? And just the general turn to the right towards more conservative politics. We'll see that turn to the right just keeps going all the way to the present. Like, what is the cultural leftovers of this crisis of confidence? Oh, we don't have a lot. We don't have much time left. If nobody's going to answer that, um, there's a lot of cultural leftovers. There's a lot of significance to this. To understanding the crisis of confidence is to understand its how not only it was just bad times for America, but it was bad times that led to this turn to the right. Not only in terms of conservative politicians, but even those that we call liberals today are very much more conservative than you would than they like. For instance, Bernie Sanders being like this kind of so-called socialist, is basically proposing the same things that Ted Kennedy was fighting for back in the 60s and 70s. Nobody would call Ted Kennedy a socialist. But that's how far right we've gone because of this crisis of confidence. So hope you guys kind of grasp that. And we've ran out of time, so have a great day, everyone. We'll talk about the Reagan era next week.